She was storming with rage, not that her husband had been killed, though she did sort of put on the widow's robes and parade herself as this. I think what she was angry about is she'd lost power. Agathe relocates with some of the Akazu, some of these players around her, to live in Nairobi. And there's a big ex-Akazu set up there. And their point is to help and support politically, militarily, reinvasion.
Their words.
Their words.
The French say that.
The French say that. The French Refugee Commission report, if you look at it, several pages, it goes through and says that this lady was at the heart of the genocide. But these are central players of one of the worst crimes humanity's ever seen. And to forget them is, to me, to forget the crime. So I think we have to keep remembering.
Hello there. My guest this week on the Long-Form podcast is Andrew Wallis. Andrew is the author of 2 books about the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. The first book is called Silent Accomplice, the untold role of France in the Rwandan Genocide. The second book is called Stepp'd in Blood, Akazu and the Architects of the Rwandan Genocide against the Tutsi. Hello there. Before we dive into today's conversation, have you subscribed to our channel yet? If you haven't, do so. And remember to share your thoughts with us in the comments below and like this video. Your support means a lot. Now let's get into it. Andrew, welcome to the Long-Form.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure. Real pleasure.
So before we get into the details of the 2 books that you wrote about the goings-ons around the 1994 genocide, I'd like to ask you a question. Why did you find it so important to write about the events that happened in 1994?
Well, the basic personality trait behind all of that is curiosity. So I sort of get into trouble because I'm constantly, if someone tells me their name, I want more than the name. I want where they're from, what are they doing, why are they doing it? You know, the questions people don't always ask behind. And really, when I first came to Rwanda in 1991.
1991?
In 1991, I'll elaborate a little bit. I was just a student. I was just a student at university, and with a friend of mine who was just finished university, he was working for a pig farming newspaper.
So wait, so you came in 1991.
Yeah.
You were an undergrad, postgrad?
Yeah, I was just an undergrad at that point. I was just
what university?
Just at Cambridge. So there I was. We thought it'd be a bit of a laugh to come around Africa in a Bedford truck. It was one of these sort of overland expeditions, and you go through, we'd see the guerrillas in Rwanda, we'd go into Uganda, we'd go around into Zaire, Congo as it now is. Have a look at, you know, this area we'd never even thought about before. So we arrived one very wet night in Kigali back in, I think,
1991.
June or July 91. Touchdown. Went into the, what was then a pretty decrepit airport. You know, it was in a bit of a state, I remember then.
What, can you take us to that? Because when you think about the Kigali International Airport now, it's
well, you
could
shiny. Yeah, absolutely. You could sort of take off the international because it was really just a sort of run strip with a sort of hut at the end. That was my, I may be being a bit harsh there, but that was my, you know, all I'd seen was Heathrow and Gatwick, these big airports, and Charles de Gaulle, and then Kigali was really, that was a bit of a shock to start with. The second big shock was when we got through to get the visas. My friend, as I said, was just a, you know, 22, 23-year-old, just started his first job writing about pigs. They said to him, what do you do? And put his landing pass. He put journalist, you know, very proudly. He'd just done his journalism exams. And of course, in 1991, if you landed in Kigali International Airport in the middle of a civil war with all sorts of stuff going on, and you put journalist, you were in trouble.
Did you guys know
that there was a civil war going on?
We had, the tour company had admitted this rather important fact that here we were, you know, we were just two sort of rather young and pretty ignorant Western tourists who wanted to go and see some gorillas and drive around a bit of Africa. But the net result was they wouldn't let him out of his hotel. They put him under house arrest. They said, right, you're not going anywhere. You're not going to see anything. Gorillas, no chance. So, poor, he never did get to see the gorillas.
Did you?
I did. And it was fabulous. It was. I sometimes wonder whether any of the gorillas I saw then are still alive. But I remember the first night, so he had that bad news. He was in the hotel but couldn't get out. I was in the hotel the first night. I remember looking up. One of those feelings when you're lying in bed and you're thinking to yourself, something's not quite right here. Couldn't quite, woke up in the middle of the night. And I looked down and the bottom of my bed was just underwater. Because this hotel, the roof had just, it was a stormy night. The roof had just sort of, so the room was literally just swimming with water. Everything was, and I thought, wow, this is welcome to Kigali here.
Yeah.
But I think we only stayed a couple of days and then we got up to the volcanoes, which was, a superb experience.
It must have been, again, for anyone who doesn't know the history of the time, the RPF the RPA, the Rwanda Patriotic Army, was actually based in those.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, in every dimension, both in Kigali, there were armed men around. It was, which we weren't expecting at all. And a route up there, you saw one or two sort of military patrols, whatever. But at no point were we actually told. So it's only when I got back, and probably, you start to look in. There's no internet in those days, of course. You don't have a quick look on Facebook and find out Instagram what's going on.
So you literally went into a war zone.
Went into a war zone.
1991.
1991.
Well, do you remember which mountain it was that you...
Now you're asking. We went up the volcano. And we went up, we trekked to see the gorillas for a couple of days. I remember it taking a couple of days to get up there.
Yeah, because the reason I'm asking that is because it was well known that the rebels at the time were in some of those mountains.
Absolutely.
So I was wondering, maybe by some luck of yours, you chose the right mountain to climb to go and see the gorillas. Because you could have been caught in a crossfire.
Absolutely, but we could have been. The fact we weren't is, the tour leader, I think he was a British ex-army guy, had no idea. At no point were we told, this is what's going on, guys.
It's very dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think news has changed so much, and the way we gather news in the time since. Now if there's a terrorist attack anywhere in the world, it's news. Some will be on AP or one of the news wires, and it'll probably come up somewhere. But back in the 80s, 90s, Africa was off the radar.
Dark continent.
The dark continent, and the news was dark, i.e. there was none.
Yeah.
Did I ever know that Habyarimana was the president of Rwanda? No. Did I know about Mobutu in Congo? No. All these things were sort of mysteries. And I look back, and it's a source of astonishment, really, that we could be so ignorant.
And then you get back to Kigali and you just continue your merry way.
Yeah, well, I think from there we went off. I think we might have gone into, where did we go? I think we went into Zaire, actually. Bumped around there because there were no roads. The Bedford truck broke down after every sort of 3 kilometers because the roads was just, it was just potholes, and then drove back into Uganda and then down. And to say my poor friend was stuck in the hotel and not allowed out for all that time. So he learned a lesson there. That,
not to call himself a journalist.
Not to call yourself a journalist is a dangerous thing. So some years later, when I was doing a master's degree in peace studies and I had to choose a topic, I thought, wow, well, this is it might be worth having a little look. And that's really where, the sort of, my eyes sort of popped. I couldn't believe all this pretty horrific stuff that was coming out.
So when you wanted to do your peace studies and writing a book about all that, because you came to Rwanda in 1991.
Yeah.
The genocide against the Tutsi happens in 1994.
Yeah.
Were you aware of the genocide at the time?
I think so. I remember, watching the news, and it was on BBC News, nothing like as much as it should have been, but, there were reports. So I was pretty aware of international politics, I think, the most. So I followed it, but it wasn't really till probably 2 or 3 years afterwards, 97, 98, when I was doing a master's degree, that I then had the time to actually...
To dig around.
Yeah, to dig around, and especially into the role of France. That was what jumped off the page immediately.
Why?
Because there was no information on it. And anything, as I said, sort of my inquisitive nature, you sort of see that's interesting. You go to look, there's nothing there. You go to look, there's nothing there. And I ended up having to go to France to actually talk to some people there to try and find out. And I got connected with Survey, the organisation, and the wonderful Sharon Couteau. And they were already starting their investigations there into France. It was all early days, really.
What was that experience like?
Well, it's been a fairly similar experience since. It was a long time ago now, but in the sense that bring a British researcher into the Rwanda story, Rwandan tragedy, you're pretty much on your own. There's not much support or help or community of journalists or researchers or academics there. Whereas in France and Belgium, there is quite a big community of researchers who sort of feed off each other, help each other, because you could say they're more involved. But for the UK, it was a genocide that we weren't interested in at the time, either the government or really sort of the NGOs or human rights organizations. It sort of seemed to drift past. And that's certainly the attitude today as well.
Yeah, and how did you move from that initial interest into now writing quite a thick book?
Well, yeah, I've been writing on and off for a long time, 20 plus years. I took I qualified as a journalist because I thought I'd go into that, worked for some local papers in Manchester. Being a local journalist, as you indeed may appreciate, you're covering a lot of stories which really you've got absolutely no interest in. It's about filling the paper. And my editor just wanted, it's a school competition day which you're covering, or it's old age people's home which is burnt down, or all of which are interesting but not to me. So then I thought to myself, well, I'll go back to university and start doing some proper research, which is what I did. And then that research became my first book in 2006.
Which book?
And that was Silent Accomplice, which the Untold Story of the Role of France in the Rwandan Genocide. Notice the Rwandan Genocide, not Rwandan Genocide against the Tutsi, because then denial wasn't what it has become since. So everyone knew who was involved in those days. So, so 2006 was when the book came out. Interestingly, it came out within a couple of weeks of Bruguiere's report on the the plane crash.
Yeah. For those who don't know that report, what was it about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating time. Rwandan-French relations sort of go from worse to appalling to sort of completely being cut off as the 2000s go on. And by 2006, a French judge, Jean-Louis Bruguiere, had been charged by President Chirac with finding out who had shot the plane down.
Whose plane?
Yeah, indeed. Sorry, you have to keep telling you to unpack these things. Yeah. So the plane of President Habyarimana, which was shot down on the 6th of April, 1994, allegedly triggering the genocide. Some people think it was the trigger. Some people, there's an argument going. Anyway, the plane came down. There was lots of people making lots of theories and conspiracy theories then and now about who shot the plane down. The French intelligence had a role. There was French mercenaries allegedly involved. The Belgians were allegedly involved. Hutu militants, extremists were allegedly involved. And of course, the RPF had to be allegedly involved. So, there's never been a UN inquiry into it. So the French initiated their own inquiry. And they put it in the hands of this Judge Bruguiere, who's a very controversial figure. He's had some other very controversial findings in some of what he's done over the years. So in 2006, after years of leaking bits of this report, out it comes at the end of 2006. And to the shock of no one, he finds it's the RPF. Then you look into the report and you see who's actually... which witnesses he's seen. He never came to Rwanda, which is remarkable. For a crime scene, you've never been to the scene of the crime.
And so he was an investigative judge.
He's an investigative judge, exactly. So what he does really is he just interviews witnesses in France. He doesn't come here to see the scene, to interview anyone. He doesn't really interview international elements, Belgians, etc., who were around at the time. And he chooses people to interview who were RPF defectors, who were members of the ex-FAR, the ex-Rwandan military, some of the extremists themselves. It was a whole collection of the sort of the bad and the worse. And of course, then you have the report comes out, the Rwandan government here, on the back of that, cuts off diplomatic relations, not surprisingly.
With the French.
With the French. And they say, look, enough is enough. Not only have you been complicit in this genocide, but you're now trying to turn history on its head and accuse us. So, yeah, relations hit rock bottom for 2 or 3 years after that. So that was, into all of that, my book came out. So it was a sort of, good for me, I guess. And made headlines in the UK, which I said is no mean achievement, really.
Yeah. So recently, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, a few days before this year's commemoration period, he says France, which could have stopped the genocide with its Western and African allies, did not have the will. Did not have the will. When you read that statement, what was your take on it? Especially because in your book, you call the French state a silent accomplice to genocide. So one, I want to kind of know what your reaction was to his recent statement, and secondly, in your book you write, France is an accomplice to genocide, is complicit. What evidence did you have for those allegations of complicity?
Well, this is a very, very controversial area, obviously, depending on who you are. and which line you're going to take. So my first response, the first part of that question there is France is blaming and saying, yes, they could have done more. But immediately after that, it's saying it's not just France could have done more, but it's basically the international community, African Union could have done more. We all could have done more. So we take responsibility, but actually everyone needs to take responsibility. America didn't do what it could have done. The UK didn't, etc. So you're watering down, to me, the blame. You're sort of putting your hand up and saying, yes, it was me, but it was also everyone else. Now, to me, that's not a proper...
It's not a proper anything.
It's not a proper anything. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's difficult to know what to make of that. He is under pressure to say something, but is also under pressure not to say too much. So you get these very muddied responses which don't quite add up. And every word is looked at by French journalists who are interested in this and French NGOs who are looking at this and saying, look, does this amount to complicity, is what you were saying. Does it amount to complicity? Are you saying your country was an accomplice, an active accomplice of a genocidal regime?
In this statement, he doesn't.
He doesn't, exactly.
But then you allege otherwise.
Well, okay, so then you get into the whole argument of what is complicity. How would you define complicity?
How did you define it?
Well, to me, if you add up everything that France was involved in, and you're looking at the arming of the ex-FAR, the armed forces over several years, okay, and groups like the Presidential Guard, some of the most active elements of genocide. They were certainly also helping, arming, training the Interahamwe. They were certainly financing, sending millions of francs of arms to this genocidal regime. And I should say there, when I say genocidal regime, I'm not just referring to the so-called interim regime, which took power when the Habyarimana's plane went down. So there's two regimes, and I think it's important to look, and my second book goes in a bit more detail, but President Habyarimana, who came to power in 1973, his regime, I would also say, was a genocidal one. There was genocide going on in Rwanda from 1990, and we sometimes forget that. All the focus is on 1994.
Actually, some would actually go further and say that there were instances even before 1990.
Before 1990, sure. I mean, under Kayibanda, what was going on in the First Republic. But in terms of Habyarimana's reign, from 73 to 90, actually the Tutsis are so much second-class citizens. They have no power to do anything. It's not an issue for the regime. It's only 1990 when the RPF, the Tutsi exiles, invade, that suddenly changes and they become an active threat. So I would say between 1990 and 94, April 94, there were genocidal attacks all over Rwanda. And during that time, it is clear the French are keeping Habyarimana in power. In certainly 1993, when the RPF launched a huge counterattack, they would have taken Kigali had the French military not been embedded here, had reinforced and made it clear that if the RPF came too far, there would be repercussions. So, complicity, I mean, if arming and financing and training an army that is killing its own people is not complicity, I wonder what is. And on top of that, you've got the diplomatic and political support, which is really important. At the United Nations, it is clear that France is working behind the scenes to make sure that nations basically keep out of this conflict. They back France. They basically say the Arusha Peace Accords, which tried to sort out all the conflict in August 1993. You try and make sure that was going to fix everything up. But clearly Arusha wasn't going to fix it. It was, a sticking plaster at best. And I think the French knew that. So complicity is a tough word, but sometimes you have to put your hand up, but sorry these days, it's not just sorry is the hardest word, but, going beyond that. And it seems to me, the French are going to take a long time to come to terms with this. I mean, I would say maybe not in the lifetime of some of the actors who are still alive, who were working in 1994. So when these people have died, when you've had a sort of 40, 50 years' time, then I think more information will come out. Maybe people will be more willing to take the blame. While some of these actors are still alive, that becomes much more difficult.
Okay. So you've kind of given us an overview of the complicity argument. I'd like to go into a bit more facts, evidence of the case.
Okay.
So you talked about diplomatic cover. You talked about funding. You talked about military support. You talked about training the Interahamwe militia. Give me the facts. Lay the facts on the table. What's your evidence?
What's your evidence? Well, thankfully, and it has taken many, many years for all of this to come out. There's been slow leaks. The French have been very reluctant over the years to release any of their archives. But in the last 4 or 5 years, we've had some of Francois Mitterrand's papers released.
What did they say?
Well, we'll come back to them, but just to keep going on that, then we had Vincent Duclert when Macron came to power. He said, okay, enough of this leaks of information. Let's have a fully fledged report done. We'll get an independent inquiry, independent actors come in, go through all the archives and establish what actually went on. Now that again, what you have at the end, the Duclert report, which was released 3 years ago now, it came up with some of the answers. It certainly had access to an awful lot of papers, which no one had seen before, from the Quai d'Orsay, from the Foreign Ministry, from the Defense Ministry, from the Prime Minister's office, from Mitterrand himself, some military, some of the attachés' reports from Kigali. So there's a lot of information they trawled through for 2 years. And again, they came to a very similar conclusion to the one you quoted earlier, which Macron has come out with. France was responsible, but only up to a certain point.
But the Duclert report came out much later. Because your book came out in 2006.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there were some facts that you believed buttressed your point of view that
there was enough. Certainly there was enough.
So what were those facts even then?
Well, so in the early 2000s, a lot of NGOs were doing a lot of digging, but a lot of it was not so much documentation because that had not been released. Archives were shut. It was very difficult to get into them. But what we did have was witness evidence. So if you went to Bisesero, if you went to some of the churches, if you talked to ex-military, ex-FAR officers who had basically had enough of this cover-up. So we had an awful lot of witness testimony, which is what was sort of opening this up. You're thinking, well, if all these witnesses cannot be wrong.
Did you talk to any French former officers as well?
Well, now they came on the scene a little bit later. Up to 2006, there was a blanket cover-up, really. And I understand.
You call it a conspiracy?
Well,
silence?
It's a sort of conspiracy, but you've got to think, do you dob your colleagues in? Military units are very closed shop. You look after your comrades. you fight with them, you die with them. You certainly don't, after the war, say, yeah, but that one committed human rights violations, or I saw that one raping that girl. That's you just got to put up with that, really.
Yeah.
Having said that, around 2011, 2012, I think it was, certainly a sergeant came forward, Thierry Pugno, and very bravely, I think, started to say what we all knew.
What did he say?
Well, he was saying, he had served here in 93, he served here in 94, and what he was seeing was, when they set off, they were told it was the Tutsi were the bad guys, the Hutus were the good guys getting exterminated. Everything was on its head. When he went to go back at the end, he'd compiled a list of those he thought were responsible. It was lost. What he thought,
list of who?
A list of people who had taken part. So he was basically saying...
From regime or...
Yeah, from the regime. And it was all just, when one of the big issues with Turquoise is it failed to arrest those it knew were involved.
Those that you're talking about, the infamous Zone Turquoise.
Absolutely.
Of 1994?
Yeah. So in late June, France decides, having stayed out the first time of Rwanda while the genocide's going on, suddenly decides to intervene, comes in with a alleged humanitarian force, but it turns out to be just really a hardcore, heavily armed, a bunch of French soldiers, planes, helicopters, the whole works. Totally unfit for saving people. This was, Turquoise was sent in, meant to save people, but in fact, if you look at how it was made up, it was sent in to fight. So there's issues there. They were, when they left, they allowed all the interim genocidal actors, the Interahamwe, the ex-FAR, the regime, prefets, administrators, to come into the zone and then to exit the zone into Zaire, into a nice, quiet retirement, as it were. And basically kept them away from the RPF, who were then sweeping inwards.
Yeah, and this soldier, this sergeant, he had a list.
Yeah, he made a list of those he'd seen, he'd heard. He thought these actors needed to be arrested, and it wasn't acted on. He was also up at Bisesero, so he had his own views on the Bisesero incident, where, to briefly recap what happened, a large amount of Tutsis, maybe 60,000, had gone to the hills of Bisesero. As the genocide wore on, they found it more and more difficult to hide in the hills. The Interahamwe were coming into the hills every day to search for them, to kill them. And then one day, they saw these French troops arrive, and they thought, wow, we're saved.
Yes.
They're going to save us. They came out.
Hiding.
They were hiding. They came out. They saw the troops. And then they discovered the French troops had actually come up with a known Interahamwe with them. And the French troops said, sorry, we don't have the ability to save you now, but we'll come back. And in the intervening 3 days it took for the French to come back, hundreds were killed. So when the French did come back, what they found were...
There was no one left to it.
There were a few, but certainly a huge amount. And that caused an immense controversy. And indeed, there's a legal case still going on in France about this. But Pugno was one of the French who came up on the first day, and he was pressing his officer to say, we need to go back. We need to go back. These people are being killed. He saw the desperation and he saw what was going to happen. Unfortunately, he was unable to get them to come back within, the necessary time.
You're telling me all these stories and the time, and I just keep asking myself a question, which is, why is it so hard for the French just to say, we messed up. We're sorry. And we will endeavor not to do this anywhere else ever again. Is it an issue of just national ego? Is it an issue of perhaps the fear of legal liability for abandoning people? Are they worried that they might be sued? Are they worried about, the image of that great France? What exactly, maybe it's unfair to ask you this question, but I'd like to maybe just have a better understanding of what is it about them, right? There's their facts, their archives, the history, witness testimony. Why is it so difficult?
Well, a bit of me says you need to ask the French there, because I have to say I have a British mindset, not a French one, so I don't myself understand sometimes. In the same way, a perpetrator in court so very rarely just puts his hand up and says, yes, it was me. There's something stopping him saying that. And I think all of the above that you mentioned, certainly compensation is as soon as you say sorry, you open yourself up to compensation. So I'm sure the financial issues around this of saying sorry, saying we were complicit. There's also, of course, just like no one wants to put their hand up and say, yes, I'm a genocidal perpetrator. I'm a psychopath who likes killing people. No one wants to say that. No one also wants to say, yes, I helped that psychopathic perpetrator to kill, young kids, to burn, churches down on top of thousands, etc. So, as I said to you, my belief is, and taking Algeria, which is where the French were also responsible for some horrendous crimes there in the late 50s when Algeria was trying to get independence. That took, 50, 60 years for anything like a half-decent apology. So all the actors involved in that were dead. And that is my feeling and possibly fear that it will be the same for Rwanda. When certain individuals, I won't mention for fear of being sued for libel, when they have died, I suspect things will open up and normalize a bit more when all these actors are gone from the scene. While they're there, I think there's a fear. And they've also got very powerful lobbies. The military lobby in France is very, very powerful. The ex-military, these generals, individuals who were colonels then and now generals now, and, the retired military lobby is very powerful. I say the British themselves, we clearly committed war crimes while we were in Afghanistan, just in the recent past. And also I would say in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And yet the military are not held responsible for some pretty horrendous crimes there. Government are working out ways around holding these people to account. Holding your military to account is a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah. It's funny, on the topic of France. Right now, Agathe Kanziga Habyarimana
Indeed.
Lives in, if I'm not mistaken, Paris.
Cocoon.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if for people who don't know who she is, she's the wife of the genocidal president Juvenal Habyarimana, and according to the book that you wrote, Steeped in Blood, Akazu and the Architects of the Rwandan Genocide against the Tutsi, she was a central figure of this Akazu. And I guess it's still about France, if France is trying to figure out a way to, wiggle, maybe I'll say it, to wiggle out of their responsibility and their complicity in genocide, how then, or why then, is it still such a home for genocidaires and alleged genocidaires? why hasn't France done everything in its power to kind of separate itself from these very dirty figures of history?
Well, again, good questions. And I'm sure people at the Elysee will have probably the best answers. I mean, we can just speculate.
So let's speculate.
Okay, so let's speculate. So in the days immediately after the plane crash here, so the streets of Kigali, and indeed most cities, most towns in the country, except Butari at this point, were being filled with roadblocks and with the bodies of Tutsis. You know, churches were being attacked, Tutsis were being rounded up, and the country was basically in the midst of an apocalypse. Now, into all of that, Agathe Habyarimana was still in the presidential palace down in Kanombe, which is near the airport. And she requested her good friend, Francois Mitterrand, the French president, to get her out of here. She didn't like being in the middle of what looked like a pretty grim place to be. Did she know the genocide was planned and organized? Was she part of that? Is that why she wanted to get out? We can have our own thoughts on that. Anyway, Mitterrand saw it as greatly important that she, above all, was flown out. And so she and members of her family, Seraphim Rubakumba, and other senior members, we would say, of Akazu, of this little network, were flown out, ended up flown out by the French, on the first French flight out of here. So France had sent in so-called Operation Amaryllis, which was designed to rescue any French, but also Belgian, others who wanted to get out. Basically, the whites were got out. If you were a Tutsi and you worked for one of those whites, you were left. So these were flown out. On the first flight, Mitterrand made it clear that she was a priority number one to get her to Paris. So she was got to Paris. She was given a nice big check as a greeting. She was given flowers. She was given a nice house for her and her kids to live in while they got the funds to buy something else. So it was all good from her point of view. Did she condemn the genocide at all? No. She was given ample opportunities. Will you condemn what is going on in Rwanda? No response. During those days of the genocide, what she does do is continue to be in touch with members of the regime who were doing the killing. We know she went on some arms runs to get more arms. I met a senior Burundian politician who met her at the tail end of the genocide, well, just after, in August, in Zaire, and he described her as an ugly person, an angry and an ugly person. And that's not about her physicality, that's about her character. She was storming with rage about what had happened. One suspects she was storming with rage, not that her husband had been killed, though she did sort of put on the widow's robes and parade herself as this. I think what she was angry about, she'd lost power, she'd lost influence, she'd lost wealth, and she was now a nobody. And she didn't take kindly to that. And you know, you've got to put yourself in the mind of someone who for 18 years had been Rwanda. Her family had run this place like a sort of, you know, it was their own, you know, company.
Would you like to partner with us here at the Longform? If you do, you can send an email to us at longformrwanda@gmail.com. Partner with us and become part of Rwanda's most exciting and in-depth podcast.
Kind of get more into details with something that you said, that during the genocide, she, instead of being the mournful widow, you know, sitting in her apartment in Paris, you know, dressed in black, crying, which would be a normal reaction to anyone who's actually lost someone in tragic circumstances. She then goes out of her way to go and look for arms and and try to support this genocidal enterprise that is happening at that very moment.
Absolutely. And you see this not just during the summer, but what is happening after the summer. So in the years following, the 2 years following the genocide, Agathe relocates with some of the Akazu, some of these players around her, to live in Nairobi. And there's a big ex-Akazu set up there. And their point is to help and support politically, militarily, the reinvasion.
Wait, are you saying that Agathe left France at some point to live in Nairobi?
Absolutely, yeah.
I had never heard of that.
Yeah, she relocates. She wants to be nearer the action, as it were, because they really believe in August. You see interviews, Bagger
That's
Store.
August of 1994.
94, absolutely. So the genocide is brought to an end
around July.
In July, beginning of July. So at this point, all the forces of the ex-FAR go into exile. The former Rwandan army go into exile, and the Interahamwe go with them. And they all take pretty much all their arms and ammunition with them, because the Congolese, Zairian forces don't take them off them, nor do the French. So you've got this bizarre situation of an army of around 40,000 on the border of Rwanda, just waiting to come back in. And they fully intend to come back in, and they fully intend to finish the job when they do come back in. So for the next 18 months, 2 years, this is a very real threat. The new government here, is not only having to try and repair a country which is half empty, which has got almost no exchequer, which has completely broken down services, law and order. There's no police, there's no judges.
There's no money in the
There's no
bank,
electricians.
nothing.
Indeed, I talked to a prefect who said he cycled around his prefecture on a bike for 6 months because there was no cars. They'd been taken. And in fact, a whole tea factory was dismantled and taken over the border.
Mm.
So they took everything. They stripped the country and off they went. But more important, they had this fully armed military there, 40,000 waiting to come back in.
I know in Nairobi, you had the politicians.
Absolutely. So you have the political setup. You had Musha Zed, the brother, Agathe's brother. You have Agathe. You have Kabuga. You have Bizimana. You have a whole work of people there.
Yeah.
And what they're doing is they're fundraising. So they spend 2 years fundraising. You have Hassan Mgazi, who was the writer behind Kangura.
Yes.
Absolutely. This really extremist Hutu magazine. He's based there with Georges Ruju, the Belgian journalist who's helping.
RTLM, the Radio de Mille Collines.
Actually, no, that's been brought to a close.
No, I'm saying that George was actually one.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Sorry,
Yes.
yeah. When he was over in Nairobi, he was helping Ngazi with his magazine.
Mm.
So they were now bringing out international. You've got the international version of Kangura,
Yes.
aimed not at Rwandans anymore, but aimed at the international community to say, hey, please fund us. We need money.
Yeah.
And we're the good guys here.
Mm.
So you've got this network, and you've got Augustin Bizimungu, who is the head of the ex-FAR, doing these sort of shuttle trips between Nairobi to pick up funds, come back to Zaire, and he's shuttling over. He's going to Libya to talk to Colonel Gaddafi. He's going to see Bongo in Gabon. Agathe is flying. She's got her husband's address book, ringing up all his old dictator contacts, saying, give us money, give us arms, because we need to go back in. We need to take Kigali. We need to finish the job. So for 18 months, there's a very rocky road. No one quite knows how this is going to go. Will the invasion happen? The government here certainly didn't know. There are a lot of people in this country who hoped it would. And the international community who seemed, as usual, paralyzed, just as they were when the genocide started. All they were doing is feeding the refugees. There was no political solution to this crisis. They just carried on feeding the military.
Yeah, and obviously the invasion did not happen because there was a preemptive action on the part of the RPA of the time. And then does Habyarimana Agathe then just go back to France?
Well, she goes back eventually via Gabon. I think in 1998, she finally moves to France. Though she doesn't have a visa or anything, she goes in as an undocumented refugee, as it were.
And the French knew who she was.
Oh, of course.
And they because they obviously have intelligence services, they knew what she had been up to.
Absolutely.
So could someone say that they were complicit in that sense, that even if they were not complicit for genocide, which is what we believe they are, at least they must have been complicit at some level for the support of a known terrorist and providing refuge.
But you know, we look at it now and we say a known terrorist. You and I might, and other people watching this might think that, but there'll be some who will say, well, you know, she's just an old lady. She's an old widow. She lost her husband and she's innocent until proved guilty. She's never been on trial. So therefore, these allegations are just allegations.
But then, as you said, she did get into France without documentation.
Absolutely.
That means it was a decision to let her in at the highest level. Because if I went to France, if I tried to get into France today without a passport or a visa, I'll be sent on the first flight back home to wherever I came from.
Absolutely.
So,
but you see, this is 1998, and the world in 1998 in Rwanda, Rwanda-French relations was a whole different place to where it is now. So in 1998, President Chirac had taken power at the Élysée. Now, like Mitterrand, he was no lover of the new government here. I mean, that's Pastor Bizimungu was then the president, but obviously Paul Kagame was still very much someone to be reckoned with. For Chirac, it was quite right that this the former wife of Habyarimana should come. And it takes her several years before she actually applies for papers. And she's able to sit in France and for several years. And then finally she decides, yes, I better get proper refugee status. Applies to the Office of Opera, as it's called, which is the refugee office in France. They look at her, they do a report, and they find that she was at the heart of the genocide. Their words.
Their words.
Their words. The
French say that.
The French say that. The French Refugee Commission report, if you look at it, several pages, it goes through and says that this lady was at the heart of the genocide.
As a member of the Akazu.
Yeah. And it also specifies her brother Zed and Sagatwa, another brother, and you know these other individuals around it, how it had been set up. And that was appealed to the Council of State, and they came back and they said 3 years later, indeed, she was, you know, there's consistency here. In every time she's applied for something, people have knocked it back. She applied to the European Court saying her rights had been, pushed aside by these French courts, and they turned her down. She was arrested, released the same day, and all these years later. And in fact, it's interesting that in the last couple of weeks, there have been several reports in the French press about her, sort of exposing how and why is this woman still free in France? I mean, why is she in France at all to start with? And secondly, with her record, how has she never stood trial? That's the question, and all of them ask it. And reply, there has been none so far. We're still waiting.
Yeah, we are. I'd like to have a better understanding of this family network that she was a part of, that according to your book, she might have even actually led. This Akazu, which in Kinyarwanda means little house.
That's right. Yeah.
So can you help us have a better understanding of what was the Akazu? How did it operate? especially before the genocide, during the genocide, and after the genocide?
Well, to me, I remember when I first heard the term, I was fascinated by it. Because you can imagine in the country, you've got a government, you've got a church officials, government officials, administrative officials, your prefets and your burgmeisters and whatever, all the way down to your cell leaders. You've got your businessmen, you've got your military.
And you have the political leadership as well.
And you have the political leadership, indeed. So imagine, that's your normal country lineup. Most countries have got that sort of, leadership in all those different areas. Now imagine having a parallel leadership. So you've got all of those you'd normally expect, but imagine that actually running parallel to them, stepped aside from them. All of them are being controlled.
There's a real power.
By a network. So in your country, you've got the official power, and then you've got this parallel network, which is running. It's sort of like a mafia. Some people describe it as a mafia. Or you could also have seen it described as, if you think of a plant, when it puts down its roots, rhizomous roots, and these are, as a plant grows, it'll send a root out, and then another plant will come up here, and it'll send out a root, and a plant will come up here. And so before you know it, you've got all these little semi plants, but they're all answering to the mother plant. So there's different ways of understanding what the Akazu is, but the basic, easy way, I think, to think about it is it's a family, as you said, the family group, the little house. So, and it's based around Agathe.
How did it work?
And how it worked was, so Agathe was right at the center. And then she had, obviously, I'm putting aside the president for a little bit, the husband. You've then got the brothers, the brother-in-law. So you've got Elik Sagatwa, brother.
Agathe's brother.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Zed, Monsieur Zed, as he was known, Proteus Zigwanyezu.
And who was he?
Very powerful figure. He was the prefect of Bruguiere during the 1980s. Some would say, allege that he was responsible for the death of Dian Fossey, the famous guerrilla observer in the volcanoes. Very powerful individual. Seraphim Rubukumba.
So Zed, was he also a brother?
Yeah.
He was Agathe's brother.
There's effectively three brothers.
Okay.
Or brothers-in-law, step-brothers, however you want to interpret the quite difficult lineage
but they're all part of her family.
They are all part of her family. So Sagatwa was effectively the man who controlled the president. So if you wanted to see President Habyarimana, you had to go through Colonel Sagatwa.
So what did he do? What was he in charge of?
He was an intelligence guy.
Okay. Was he head of the intelligence?
He was sort of head of intelligence, yeah. Not military intelligence, but sort of state.
Why do you say sort of?
Well, sort of, because all these roles are very, I would say, nebulous. They're very difficult to define. So if you ever see a picture of Habyarimana in the 1970s or 80s, even early 90s, you will always see Sagatwa in the background. He was the grey man. He was always just behind the president. If you want to see the president, you've got to go through Sagatwa. He decides who sees him. So he's got a huge amount of power. And then you've got Seraphim Rubukumba, who is another brother, very interesting figure, often left out. He is now living in Brussels. So he got out on the same flight as Agathe. He was involved with the central bank. Then he set up a company here, an export-import company.
When you say involved, what does that mean?
Well, you would have to talk to Mr. Bruguiere, who was the head of the bank. But certainly there were allegations of corruption going on with foreign exchange. That's what Rubukumba was in charge of.
So he was an employee of the central bank?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. But he dealt with foreign exchange. There are allegations involved in drug dealing as well. And nearly late 80s, he then goes into import-export business and again becomes a very rich man very quickly with all his contacts. He's heavily involved with RTLM, the radio. He buys shares there and is heavily involved in the broadcasting output of that. As I said, he's now in Brussels. He's never stood trial. He's been investigated countless times by the Belgian police, but we don't know where that case is any more than we know where the case against Agathe is from the French.
What's the allegations against him?
Well, complicity in the genocide, basically. You know, certainly with his role in asylum. But again, the Belgian police have not been forthcoming with, again, he's been denied, as far as my understanding is, refugee status because he's involved.
So all these men, we'll go back to the Akazu, but then, so it sounds to me as if, so he's been denied refugee status. So how is he there?
Well, again, I'm not an expert on Belgium law or Belgium. You know, I find it very difficult to believe the Belgians have the knowledge because they've investigated for years, in the same way the French have with Agathe, that there is not some political blockage here which is stopping judicial findings taking over. Yeah, because I can't see any other reason why. There seems to me to be a clear case to answer in court. So why that case does not come to court, you would have to ask the Belgian political classes or the prosecutor there. What is stopping that happening? Yeah. I can only guess.
I'm sorry, I kind of took you on a tangent.
That's fine.
So yes, you were breaking down the membership. So there is the banker. Who then becomes a traitor. Yeah. Then there's the intelligence officer, who is really the one person who can get you to the president. Yeah. And then there was Zed. Who was a former prefect of very strategic Ruhengeri.
Yeah, and to come back to why is Ruhengeri strategic? Because it's right on that border. And the border is up to Uganda is very porous. There is drugs going in and out. There's arms. There's diamonds. There's all sorts of illicit contraband stuff. And obviously, certain people stand to make an awful lot of money from that smuggling ring. And the allegation is that Monsieur Zed is the guy who makes the most out of it.
And this is before 1990.
Yeah, this is during the 80s. And this to me is a key period and which is often overlooked. You know, people talk about the Rwandan genocide. As I said, I believe the genocide is going on from 1990 onwards. Almost as soon as the RPF invade, there's a genocidal massacre at Kigali. But during the late 70s and early 80s, and as the 80s go on, the regime, this Akazu network, as I said, it expands to every part of Rwandan society. So it takes over the military, it takes over the church, it takes over the business community, it takes over the administrators. So if you want a job, if you want power, if you want influence, if you want anything at all, you need an Akazu helper. It's like a
godfather.
Yeah, exactly. The mafia thing. It is very much a godfather, and it leads up. So if you're, if you want a prefecture, if you wish your Z in your town, if you want a trader, if you want to get on, you have to come pay your respects, as it were, to Monsieur Z. He will then give you the license, or he will make sure that your business does well.
Because right now you've just literally named 4 people.
Yeah.
3 brothers and the sister. Agathe. Were there other members of the Akazu?
Yeah, a lot of other names. And you go through a sort of a list of almost anyone who was at the top of a company. Some would say the archbishops. So Vincent Zengyumva is handpicked. It's bizarre that the president handpicks really head of the Catholic Church in this country rather than the Vatican. Obviously, the military, you have 2 men. You have Colonel Serabuga, Laurent Serabuga, and you have another man called Raga Felitas, Pierre Celestin. Margarita, who was in charge of the gendarmerie. Both very, very powerful men, highly corrupt. And it's one of the reasons why the army is so ill prepared in 1990 when the RPF come, because throughout the 80s, they just used it. The army is their slush fund, really. So in every area of, and obviously, sorry, I should say, what's so important in Rwanda, of course, is local administration, your prefect and your burgmeisters, your community leaders. So that network going down, the prefect are all MRND supporters, the president's party, in fact, the only party in the 80s. That branches out, so you select burgmeisters who, again, agree with you. That goes down to commune leaders, etc. So you've got all the stages of Rwandan society taken over, really, by this mafia group.
So how big was this mafia group? And was it in the tens? Was it in the hundreds?
Well, it's difficult to say.
And were they all just members of a family, or was it, in a mafia, it's family lineages?
It is. Well, it all, to me, the structure is very much, and I've seen it described by Michel Bagaragaza, who was the head of T in this country. He was a member of Akazu. And as part of a deal he did at ICTR, he drew a graph of what he thought it looked like. And very interesting, he did sort of concentric circles. So the little circle at the middle was Agathe. Then it branched out to, as you said,
to her
the
brothers.
Then it branched out. The next circle was the sort of the church leaders, the company leaders, the military leaders. Then the circle went out, the administrators. So it's slowly taking on board. It's not a huge amount of people, but what it is, people in control of really Rwandan society, Rwandan life.
And that was almost separate from the formal structure of the state?
Yeah.
Or did they kind of become a nebulous mixture of state and
absolutely.
State?
It's interesting. In 1992, Christophe Mfizi, who is indeed still here in Rwanda.
Who's that?
Very intelligent guy. He was head of OINFOR, which is the state broadcasting network, really.
Yeah, they were the ones who ran Radio Rwanda and TV Rwanda.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So all of this in the 80s. He is replaced in the early 90s by the extremist called Ferdinand Nahimana. Now, Mfizi went to Paris, and very bravely, in my view, and wrote a short piece, which you can obtain on the internet. Do have a look at it. It's called Network Zero, or Rezu Zero.
Yes.
And the Z in that stands for Zigonyezu. And he effectively says there is this network, this mafia network. He calls it Network Zero. Other actors would say the Akazu. But it features around this family. And he explains how he has seen it taking over all the parts of sort of society. So, you can't be an egg seller in Kigali without having a benefactor, a Akazu benefactor at one level or another. To go to secondary school, to become a doctor, all your basic things of life, really, to get anywhere in Rwanda in those days was tricky.
Get a passport too.
Absolutely. Just getting a passport was very, very difficult. If you were Tutsi, getting a passport was near impossible. You needed someone who was going to sign you off to say what you did when you went abroad was okay. And when you came back, of course, you had an interview. Who had you seen? What had you done? Had you written anything you shouldn't have done? They didn't want you talking to any of the diaspora community, say in Belgium, which was pretty anti-Habyarimana. So it's highly, tightly controlled in every way, really, where you could go, just to go from one prefecture to another, you'd need a permit.
And if you may, and where does Habyarimana, as president of this state, what's his relationship between almost this kitchen government or this mafia that's actually running the country. And then he's obviously the president of the republic and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. What is the link between this network zero that had Agathe at its very top and the husband to this woman?
Well, I think everything, Habyarimana to me is a fascinating figure. Because the question is, was he a man? Was he a henpecked husband? Was Agathe really the power? And he just went along for, by all accounts, Habyarimana was a very sociable, quite quiet guy. He was happiest in his garden with his sort of Nigerian shirts on, making a barbecue for his friends. Quite sociable, quite charismatic. But, and for the first 17 years of power, that was enough. He had no real decisions to make. Once the RPF invade in 1990, once power sharing is on the table and is enacted in 1991, suddenly the whole thing changes. And I think you see with Habyarimana, he changes. He becomes anxious. He becomes a bit paranoid. He doesn't want to stay in office. It's, according to witnesses who told me, she is basically keeping him in office. He wants out. And you can understand, if you think of the strain this man is under, he's got the RPF attacking, he's got international donors threatening to pull out their money because of the human rights abuses. He's got extremists like Bisesero, agents chief Ntayombya, saying, if you don't do what we want, you're out. He's got RTLM, he's got Kangura spitting blood about what they want. And of course, he's got the RPF as well. So, and he's got the moderate opposition. So he's being attacked from every direction, really, at home, with his wife, and then almost every other place he goes, he's under siege. So you can understand, I think by Arusha, by August 1993, there's certainly, you just have to look at pictures of Habyarimana. You see television pictures of him there. The man under enormous stress. He's changed. He's aged about 30 years from just a couple of years earlier. Which is, to me, I think it's fascinating, as a man, the stress which he is under. Does he carry on this genocidal policy? Can he afford not to carry it on?
We'll never get to know because he carried on.
He did. He carried on up to the 6th of April. And the question is, and certainly for the extremists, they'd lost faith in him a year earlier. Bisesero, Ntayombya, this Amasasu in the army, extremist group in the army, had made it very clear to him that if he carried on doing deals with the RPF, then his days were numbered. So the question rises that in April, when we went to Dar es Salaam, did the extremists here see this as a sign that their days were numbered?
Are the extremists different from the Akazu?
They're intertwined, I think. Is Bisesero a part of the Akazu? No, he's not part of the inner core of it, because that was the family, but he was certainly trusted. He was certainly used. Did Agathe want Bisesero to take control after the plane crash? Certainly he wanted someone in control who she could trust, and she could trust Bisesero.
In your thinking, did the Akazu, led by Habyarimana's wife, kill Habyarimana?
Again, it's speculation.
That's why I asked you.
Yeah, I can speculate. I would be surprised if, how can I put this? I would be surprised if there wasn't a lot of interchange of information, whether that led, Agathe, we know on the evening that the plane went down, she knows her husband is dead. She is in the palace. She is raging. Witnesses say she was like a madman. She's running around. She's making telephone calls. Allegedly, it said, ordering killings. on the phone. Bagosora, meanwhile, is chairing meetings here, trying to push himself into power. Do the two correspond? That's the question.
And then because right after that, there is a new government formed, the transition government, the one of Sindikugaba.
Yeah.
The one that now takes ownership of the
Absolutely.
genocide.
Yeah.
What is its relationship with the Akazu?
Well, say the Akazu figures now. So Sagatwa, one of the brothers, is on the plane with Habyarimana. So he's now dead. Zed is still around in Kigali. You have Rubakumba is still around here. And you have other central figures who are still in play, I would say. When the plane goes down, how much do they know? How do they react? So Nehemana, who is the central man in the PLM, he goes to the embassy, the French embassy, where a lot of these figures are.
French here again.
Indeed, they're all in there. And, the role of the French ambassador here is, he doesn't seem to see this as odd anyway. There they are. Some of them then fly out to Paris. But the question is not who is on the ground, I think, because what they've done is they put into power a government. They control this, again, just like before, where you've got an official government and you've got a parallel structure. I think with the interim government, you've got the same thing. So Sindikuwabu and Kambanda are the official government, but who's pulling the strings?
Who is that?
Bagosora, and I would say still parts of the Akazu, Nehemana, the radio station. These are the guys who are Bizimungu in the army, who are still sort of reacting and actually controlling events. And really, this interim government is just, some pretty inadequate individuals. None of them stand out. They're just yes men who are there. They're aligned to Hutu power. They're happy to go along with playing this role as sort of puppet masters for the genocide.
So we are now 30 years since, the culmination of everything that the Akazu was all about.
Yeah.
So there's one member of the Akazu, Agathe, who is in France.
She's in a very nice multi-million euro house in Corcoran, indeed.
Okay. There's another one who is in Belgium.
Brussels, indeed.
His name is again?
Serafin Rubakumba.
Okay. Who else from that core group are still alive?
Zed is the most notable, I think. Now, he was arrested in the early 2000s. He tried to pass himself off as a refugee. He was trying to get, I think, into Brussels.
Arrested where?
Belgium, at the airport. Transferred to ICTR. He stood trial and was initially found guilty, and then on appeal, as seemed to happen to many, many of these judgments, released on appeal. The burden of proof, it was said, had been... for me, I would say it's a technicality, but anyway, they said the burden of proof was such it had not been sufficiently taken into account at the original trial. He was released. However, he's then applied continuously, and this was around 2009, to go to France and Belgium, where his family are.
So where is he now?
So what has happened, and this has happened to several, and this is something the ICTR never thought would happen.
That's the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda.
Absolutely, in Arusha, is they've had several either acquittals or such short sentences that the individuals have been released. So they were initially released back into UN sort of custody. Well, it's not custody, they've got a very nice safe house to live in with all expenses paid, medical expenses and all the rest of it. The question is, where do they go now? They have Rwandan citizenship.
They can come back.
They can come back here. Rwanda's made it very clear they're happy that these individuals should come back here. But surprisingly, the butcher Gisenyi, Anatole Zengyumva, for example, has made it very clear he is not coming anywhere near here. So what happened is they stayed in Arusha, the safe house, for many years. Then they did a deal with Niger, and they were flown to Niger, and they were meant to be sort of given sort of freedom in Niger. Interestingly, almost on arrival there, Niger government put them in detention and said, "We don't want you. Get out of the country." Having done a deal with the UN to take them, for whatever reason, that fell apart. Niger was persuaded to keep them, so they're now stuck in a safe house in the Nigerian capital. These 7 former ICTR detainees, including Mr. Z. And they're applying, and their very expensive lawyers are applying almost every day to go to France, go to Belgium, go to Norway, go to America, go to Canada, wherever they've chosen. Unsurprisingly, no state in the world wants them. Constantly, no state wants them. So the UN is sort of stuck with them, and this is rather bizarre because the UN says it has a duty of care to them. This duty of care involves giving them free accommodation, it involves free medical care, lawyers' fees. It's costing the UN a lot. Added to which every year, for the past 3 years, the UN's given 1,000 cash. $10,000, there you are, Mr. Z, 10,000 cash. Because we have a duty of care to you. Now, my point would be, it has a duty of care. It has a duty of care to these individuals, some of them perpetrators like Zengyumva of the worst crimes. Where's its duty of care to survivors who have not got any UN money, who don't have free UN healthcare, who don't have free UN house to live in? So, it's international justice seems to have turned everything on its head at the minute. But that's the world we live in, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's very sad. Andrew, I want to thank you for joining me. This was so enlightening for me, especially the details, the intricacies of France-Rwanda relations, especially complicity, as well as helping us understand a little bit better about the Akazu. And because sometimes these things, it's 30 years and people will start forgetting.
Absolutely.
And forgetting these men. I worried sometimes that memory will start to fade of the heinous crimes that they were a part of. And I really want to thank you for writing those books. Before we go, those books, can they be found here in Kigali?
Absolutely. I think Ikirezi Bookshop has them, and certainly Gisozi has copies of them. So yeah, do have a look. And, if they make you think, you may not agree with everything in them. I mean, analysis, opinion, you agree or don't agree with, facts hopefully speak for themselves. And they're, there's a lot of facts, but they're meant to be readable.
Yes.
I want people, as you say, to know about the subject, to know about these individuals. And as you're very right to say, if there are no perpetrators, if no one knows the names of anyone, there is no crime. It's very easy for genocide deniers to say there's no crime because there's no one responsible. And the fact that so few people can name even one person responsible for the genocide. How many people can actually say, that was Colonel Bagasora? How many people know about Agathe? Or, any other members, Ferdinand Nahimana? But these are central players of one of the worst crimes humanity has ever seen. And to forget them is, to me, to forget the crime. So I think we have to keep remembering and keep learning and keep researching, keep educating ourselves.
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure. And perhaps the next time, are you planning on doing another book about Rwanda?
You never know. You never know. Never say never.
Yeah.
The research goes on, so we see where it takes us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me this week.
Thank you, Sam.
If you enjoyed the conversation today, share your thoughts with us on our social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok.